Welcome back, guys. In the last video we conquered the daunting task of finding an awesome piece to download and print off from Loot Studios, planned out 12 build plates worth of prints, ran them through the slicer and got everything ready for the big print job. And today we're diving into the world of printing those out and post-processing them. This will involve a little bit of scraping, cleaning, filing, a little bit of sanding and priming and beyond. So join me on the transformation from these assorted 20 pieces into this gorgeous looking statue. So we left off in our last video, ready to press print and then play on the printer. And before you know it, our 20-part, 12 print adventure is underway. And then after a short wait, we're ready to begin post-processing. Now as we gently scrape the model off the build plate, so I'm focusing first on getting the build plate scraped, cleaned, gonna wash it with some isopropyl alcohol. What I'm trying to do here is maximize my efficiency and then get that plate back in the printer and get the next print started before we start processing the parts of the model. Really want to get this printer running full time and do all my post-processing whilst it's printing. So with a quick top up of resin, we're ready to start our next print. Keeping our build plate nice and clean in between prints really helps keep that adhesion and make sure we're minimizing the chance of fails on our prints. So the next step here before I remove the supports is to get all of that loose resin off the model. There's stuff on there that still hasn't cured as it came out of the vat. I'm going to use an isopropyl bath for this. Submerge the pieces in and I'm going to put this on for about 6 minutes or so. I find that gives it a pretty good wash for one build plate's worth of models. If it was really intricate with lattice work or some small parts, I might give it longer. And one of the best tips I've had for removing supports that I now try and use all the time is to give it a bath in hot water. Not boiling water, we want it under boiling so we don't wreck the resin, but this really helps loosen the grip of the supports on the model, especially some of the bigger, thicker pieces. It just really softens up those tips right where it's joined onto the model. I find the support removal after a good wash in hot water is just so much easier. Removing supports from a model can be therapeutic when you get it right. It can be a nightmare when it starts going wrong and the supports are in all the little hard to reach places. But nothing beats that satisfying rip as a base releases perfectly from its support bed. A couple other things you might find handy here is having a pair of tweezers on hand for some of the intricate small supports that are in some of the fine details. As you can see, I can reach right into the hood and sometimes up under armpits and some of those really hard to reach places to get those supports out. And here I'm aiming for about 95–96% of the supports to come off. Some of the really fine, small, intricate supports and like hair, little bits of feathers. I'll pick them up once it's been cured and I can touch it a bit easier and get a close look in there. Then you're not dealing with the resin fumes and everything while you've got your face in, looking in all the nooks and crannies for the small supports. Before you know it, we have our virtually supportless model. You can start to see the detail coming through. We'll give it its final cure. This will make it handleable without gloves. And what I try and do when I'm curing my models is basically a minute at a time. Unless they're very tiny, thin models, I might give them half a minute. Generally, I'll put them on for a minute and turn them after a minute so that I'm getting that UV coverage over the whole model. And here we have our cured model ready to touch. You can see the details starting to look really good, but we'll wait until we get some primer to see how those pop out. So I'm going to go over a few hints and tips to bear in mind when you're taking on a project like this, or 3D printing in general, as we let the montage of the 12 build plates play out in the background. I'm using isopropyl alcohol for all of my cleaning throughout this project. That's the build plate, the vat, the models itself, and basically all of my tools given the spray with ISO. That's because of the resin I'm using. Of course, if you're using a water-soluble resin, that eliminates the need for the ISO, and you can be using water for a lot of the cleanup. You do pay a little bit more for the water-washable resin. One of the tips you've probably figured out by now, but if you haven't, we want to ensure that after the ISO wash, that we let the model dry thoroughly before we put it onto the UV curing. If you don't and you've got little patches of ISO still on your model, that ISO is impregnated with resin that it's been washing off all of your previous models. That can leave white patches on your model, and this looks terrible and can be a real pain to paint over. Down to the side here, we can see I've printed off a 32mm version of the statue. This will help us compare the sizes later on. You want to make sure you've got your printer dialed in before you attempt a big project like this. There's nothing worse when you've got 12 prints to do and you start having fails. You know, that can easily turn into 24 prints with a whole lot of wasted resin if you're only getting halfway through a print before it fails. So we'll process this anyway, get it cleaned up and cured, but because of the fail, I need to pull out the filter and we need to screen the vat. So we're removing all of the debris from the resin, pouring it through a filter that'll get out all the microparticles, scraping off the huge piece that was stuck to the FEP. The last thing I want is a small piece of cured resin in there when that build plate goes down, which can then pierce the vat. I'm using isopropyl alcohol just to clean this vat up again, get it looking mint ready for the next print. This is just the extra step you want to avoid when you're doing 12 odd prints in a row for one project. Bear in mind when you're curing your models, this will be something you will have learned through your 3D printing up to date. Very small thin models don't need too much time to cure, and obviously big thick pieces need a little bit longer. One of the things I probably am not that great at adhering to, but definitely want to recommend, is some of the safety precautions with resin. A big one is ventilation, making sure your space is ventilated from all the resin and chemical fumes, ISO fumes as well. We want to be wearing gloves when we're touching uncured resin, or have the chance of any uncured resin spilling onto us. And of course, if you're not too sure, check out the manufacturer's guidelines for any specific resin handling and post-processing instructions you might need. Remember to make sure if you're topping up your vat with resin, we really need to mix that resin together before we pour it in. We want to ensure the consistency is even throughout the resin to ensure we get high quality prints. And of course, once you're done with your resin, make sure you're storing that bottle in a cool, dark place away from direct sunlight. We don't want UV light getting in from the environment and curing it prematurely in the bottle. So here we have the second attempt at the shawl of feathers. It's printed off a lot better, but you can see we still have one fail in here. This is a minute hole compared to the previous one. I think I'm going to go with this piece and make it work. Using the two pieces I've printed off, my two failed ones, I think I can combine them and get a good print out of this without needing to change the support settings, re-slice it and do the whole process again. So with a fail on the second attempt at these feathers, I'm going to work with some green putty, some green stuff, and see if I can't fix these in post-processing rather than going back, readjusting all my settings and running it through the printer again. Pretty confident I can make something usable out of the two failed prints that I've got. So now let's grab all those pieces that were printed, see if we can't get them to fit together with a little bit of persuasion and elbow grease. So with all 21 pieces laid out on the table, I'm ready to dry fit them to see what fits together well and where we have big gaps that need some attention. Small gap here looks fine. Staff will go together fine, that's pretty easy, no gaps. Robe has some small gaps, but they've hidden the cuts really well in the hems. So long as I've got something to paint on and not a huge gap, I should be able to make that work. Got a bit of a rock here on these pieces. One of the first places I begin trying to make these pieces fit together better is the little pegs from the peg and socket arrangements. You can see the feathers here sticking about ½ an inch above the model. It doesn't quite fit in. These socket and peg pieces don't work, and we're going to have to fix this hole at some point. So you can see with these two 32mm models how much bigger this statue piece is. We're definitely going big. So we have an assortment of tools, files, hand Dremel and hobby knife with an assortment of blades. So I've got them joined together into a few groups, which is what I will glue them up as. At the same time, I am removing all of the last fiddly supports. So here, after sanding the peg and socket, it's still not going together. So I'm gonna go quite hardcore and hack this socket off, this peg off, using the hand Dremel. I'm just making sure I can get my tool in there without wrecking the rest of the model. And with that extra part removed, what do you know, fits like a glove. So that will be one section there that I'll glue together. The big thick bases I usually struggle with. We get quite a bit of warpage with the curing, but having just attacked it with the sander and the filing, you can see the gaps are a lot better. And I'm not showing my sanding or filing because I was doing this outside due to ventilation. Didn't really want to be breathing the resin particles into my lungs. So let's start wrapping some of this together. Taking my 2-part epoxy, giving that a good mix and lathering it over all of the socket and pegs, pushing these together. I've tried to do it so that these parts don't need a vise or clamp to hold them together. I'm just letting gravity do its trick and everything's sitting on the ground. This is going together pretty smooth. The sanding definitely helped the fit of these pieces, and having run through a dry fit, I know some of these pieces I can glue and some of them I can't, to enable me to assemble the model fully at the end. And of course, once all these are glued together, there's still going to be some gaps and obviously holes in the feather that I need to fix. So we're going to jump into some craft work. So I've got my little piece off my secondary print that I'm going to use. So combining the two parts of my two failed prints with a little bit of green stuff, we're going to revive this print and make it usable. Now this is not my forte, I do not have experience with green stuff. I find it a little bit tricky to work with, and I might do some experimentation later on to see if I can find a different medium that applies a little bit easier than this green stuff, but it will do the trick and it will help me fill the gaps. As to the base and some of these other gaps, what I'm trying to do is really just cram the green stuff into the gap, which will then give me something to paint on rather than having a huge air gap in there once it's primed. It's amazing what you can do with the paintbrush to help hide some of these ugly looking fills. So, you know, be as meticulous as you want here. Obviously, the more time you spend on it, probably the better job you'll get, so long as your green stuff doesn't dry. And bear in mind, as terrible as this looks while it's in its raw form, a coat of primer does wonders at hiding blemishes and blending these glaringly obvious patchwork pieces into the model. Right, time for the airbrush. This is always a bit of fun. A little bit of masking over the pegs. I've cracked out some Army Painter airbrush medium and airbrush matte black primer. This is my general go-to for my black primer when I'm using the airbrush. And we start the process of layering down our black. There are other ways to prime, of course. There is brush-on primer. I would not recommend it for a project like this. Rattle can primer, rattle can spray paint primer. I generally didn't have too many issues with it, but some of the paints, speed paint in particular, didn't like some of the oil residue in those particular primers, and I did get issues. So I find the acrylic primer made for miniatures is the way to go. And of course, we're trying to get a layer of black onto everything here. So not too worried about fancy airbrush angles. We just want to get into all those nooks and crannies. As you can see, I'm using a white resin, so any nook and cranny I don't get the black into will be bright white, and we don't want that in the shadows. So it's that fine line of getting coverage over everything, but not going too thick. We don't want to start losing details. And before you know it, we've got a gorgeous looking matte black Odin the Wise statue. You can really see these details now. I've got some matte primer onto it. So much fun to be had in these details. This is why I love printing the big statues. You can just see every nook and cranny. And what I try to do here is use a handheld light to simulate a light source before I spray a Zenithal coat over the top. This just gives me an idea of what angle will look good with the model. This model in particular, I'm trying to light up his scody, damaged eye while leaving some shadow on the other side of his face for some contrast. And then applying my white ink from the same place that I established with the light beforehand, we start laying that Zenithal primer down. I'm using a white ink. This gives me a really nice blended look. I find the white primer itself can be a little bit patchy and we get a few droplets coming out. The ink goes on silky smooth. And this is the part of the painting process I really enjoy. You really see these details just popping with some contrast on there. And to be honest, you could put a clear coat over this and display it on its own. So let's take a final look at the results and see what we managed to turn those 20 unprimed pieces of model into. So now we have a nice blank canvas, so to speak. Looks amazing as it is, but it's going to be even better and brought to life with a colour paint job. But we'll leave the paint job for another video. This project might sit on the shelf for a little bit while I get a bit more painting done elsewhere. So I hope you enjoyed my video. Hopefully it might have lessened some of the nerves around printing a big statue piece like this and a big multi-part project. Make sure if you want to catch this statue being painted, you subscribe to the channel. If you want to see the previous video where we acquired Odin, check it out here, and I'll catch you on the next one.